Ron stood in the center of what was once Yamadochi, was now an almost endless wasteland of ashes and ruins. The ground was black, charred, and completely leveled with the rest of the island. The only remains of civilization that had once been there were charred, melted skeletons of smoking metal. The tall ones had remains of what Ron assumed to have been the skyscrapers and apartment complexes, while the smaller ones had most likely been houses. Various charred skeletons of other buildings lay in the burning heaps, and that was all there was for miles and miles. Any civilization that had once been there had been completely wiped out. The mountains had survived, but they were now charred black of the hills of ash. Ron could see this was remains of what looked like asphalt roads on the ground in various other directions, but they were too charred black, like the rest of the ground, and even cracked in some places. His heart sank with despair and sorrow as he gazed over what was once a highly populated, bustling civilization, now gone all completely, all wiped out in a devastating nuclear blast. Oversaturated Ron by some crazy individual who had reasons for this horrible atrocity were still unknown to him. It was impossible for him to make out anything for miles, and he could only make out hints of what looked like civilization far, far away from where he stood. Yet it was only in the speck of his current position. In the short distance where Yaminochi City had once stood there in a massive crater where the bomb had struck. It was massive, wide, and round, almost the exact same size as a football field. The sun was also blocked out by the thick clouds of radioactive dust and stood in the air around him, with his protective suit being the only thing that protected him from certain death by radiation poisoning. Ron had already scanned the area. The radiation levels were way beyond the lethal zone. He had once stepped out into the Gorchit land without a protective suit. The radiation would have killed him in less than a few minutes, if it wasn't for the suit. That wasn't even the worst part of it, though. Even though the suit had an advanced speaker system, Ron could hear absolutely nothing around him. There were no sounds of birds chirping, voices, or even the nature himself, only the gentle wind that barely blew in the air around him. It was the sound of death itself, and Ron was in the very middle of it all. The crater that made the bomb's impact only about 200 feet away from him. Wade had begun searching for various areas of the scorched earth for any signs of life in his new fighter craft, yet Rufus stayed behind with Ron. The small mole rat was then tucked inside of a sealed pouch in there, with small air holes inside to pump the fresh oxygen inside, keeping Rufus safe from any exposure to the radiation around him and Ron. As for Ron, he didn't even know where to start searching. He gazed up at one of the charred mountains about a mile away and began running towards it. He didn't know if there were one of the hidden ninja school was located, but Ron didn't care. His mind was in a mess of sorrow and desperation, as well as despair. "Yori," Ron softly said, as he ran towards the direction of the mountains, his voice filled with sorrow. "I'm coming, Yori. I won't leave you." Rufus could hear what Ron was saying, even from inside his pouch. He could tell that Ron's mind wasn't even in the right place. He seemed to have almost delusional as he ran across the scorched land, passing piles of burned rubble and melted metal. It was like walking through the sights of hell itself. Ron and Rufus were the only ones there, burned in the wasteland of ash. Ron was reminded of those horrifying images of the aftermath of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and as if he and Rufus had stepped in through time, and they were walking what remains of those horrifying images, or what have remained of the destroyed cities. History seemed to be repeating itself, only just it wasn't even mere cities destroyed in a blast. There was just three whole regions that had been wiped out. This time Ron had no idea just how many people were lost in the nuclear blast, but he was pretty sure as well in the millions that he shuddered to think of Yori being one of them. "I must find Yori. I must find her," Ron panted as he ran. eventually tapping into his mystical monkey powers to increase his running speed. "Ron, slow down," Rufus squealed, gripping tightly onto the pouch as Ron ran faster and faster. "No, Yori needs me, Rufus. I have to save her," Ron replied deliriously, clearly not thinking straight. "She needs us. She needs us all." Rufus had begun to get worried upon this point, upon how hearing disoriented Ron seemed to be acting. It was clear, seeing all the death and destruction had his mind driven him mad, or rather slowly driving him mad. "Please, she's not here," Rufus pleaded. "No, she's here. I know where she is, Rufus. She's not dead," Ron said, suddenly slowing down, "and I've come to a stop near the remains of an overpass highway and the bridge, now in pieces. She'll be there. Yori won't be dead. You'll see." He sank into his knees, panting, then looked up with the expression that read of near madness. It's just all a nightmare. All a one big nightmare," Ron stammered, now trembling. "You ran for miles, and yet you only found death when you're awake. No signs of civilization or life. All of you have just now mere memories, and those memories slowly worked your way into your belittled mind, which have been driven to determination into ingrained within you to see another way out. You desired for her, desired to see her alive and well, yet deep down the recesses of your mind, you began to slowly accept which you believed in was too damning to accept. And that harsh truth it was only you lying to yourself. Deep down, you knew it wasn't a nightmare. It was reality. You stand upon this land of ashes and death, now realizing the futility of it all. The one you loved said that there would be there for anything you do to find, yet you denied this because you didn't want to accept the truth, since it was far too damning. You entered this burned land for death, only to find that your lover was honest all this time. There is nothing for you here, nothing for you to save. Hope is all lost for this land, and you have perished. Those who have perished cannot ever be saved, for death has already claimed them. Ron was trembling more as severe as his mind was swirled with madness. "You understand now. You understand how futile it was for you to upon this place. Yet, only you now do see that the folly of you and your choice, not in the heat of words. The woman you love, you arrived here thinking you'd find someone to save, yet now you see no one can be saved. As for death has claimed you on this land upon now, you have now accepted which you have purposely rejected, and it's the cold hard truth, yet you have failed. You have failed back to save your friend, and you have failed to those who are dead, and truly you have not failed to protect the ones you love. They are still safe. As the woman you love, will you continue to hold back for her sake, or will you accept the fact that the only true way to protect those you care about is to let go of the morals you put in place as to not lose yourself within the powers you possess?" Rufus saw Ron cover his face visors with his hands and whimpered softly, his trembling not ceasing. "As you accept, however, you can recall what the metal servant of evil you had the other day. He promised himself a prize at midnight, and it is now that you understand he truly meant. You know not to know what his true name is. The only servant of the evil one was Ridley Farkas. You now feel something rise within you, something dark, something sinister, but you continue to hold back for her sake. She was afraid of you, and this is why you must hold back. You mustn't allow her to fear you, otherwise you'll lose everything. Yet your rage begins to overpower you upon learning from who's behind the atrocity, and it is how it begins to show in a sea of red." Ron then stopped trembling, and Rufus watched as he moved his hands away to reveal his face, now contorted in pure rage. Yet that was not the most terrifying part. Ron's eyes had changed from the usual brown color to the same chilling blood-red color again, like they did in the freight train yards the other day, in which he had a mecha suit to the servant of the Black Shadow. "It was him," Ron hissed. "He did this!" Who? Rufus asked, not understanding. Ron didn't respond. Instead, he suddenly began blasting heaps of burned rubble with jets of red lightning, destroying several large piles of melted metal and charred bricks before finally calming down enough to think straight. Ron's eyes then have returned to their usual brown color, and then he sank into his knees, grabbing his head in the process. You felt a taste of your own true potential, yet you still hold back. You still cling to that undying fear inside you, the fear of that woman you love and the rest of the world you fear, every existence if you allowed yourself to give in. Are you truly doing the right thing by holding back? Would you have been far able to prevent such a disaster if you used your power in full? No, not happening again, Ron stammered with a gasp of shock. That power, it's the same one I used the other day? What is this power? He had no answer to what this strange power was, but if there were something he knew, it was sinister and dangerous. Ron had also begun to realize that his negative emotions seemed to be triggering it somehow, and he only been able to tap into his sinister power when it filled with enormous amount of rage, hatred, and despair. Ron even wondered if maybe this was some darker variant of his mystical monkey powers, but he wasn't so sure if that was the case. Whenever Ron used his powers, he never felt anything sinister or malicious within his mind, only peace. However, this new power was a complete opposite of it. Whenever Ron tapped into another ability, he felt rage, anger, hatred, and despair. This was greatly concerning, as Ron seemed to have a little over control of such power when it emerged. Whenever he got incredibly angry, his power would emerge, and Ron would be filled with the urge just to attack and destroy anything and anyone around him. Ron might have done that to the mecha suit thing Thug the other day if Kim had not stopped him. Yet he knows he would just wish he had just killed them right then. That monster dropped the bomb in Japan. There's no doubt about it, Ron thought, trying to keep his rage under control. That's when he told me that he'd get his consolation prize at midnight. He was referring to the nuclear bomb that dropped in Japan last night. Ron only felt despair upon realizing how stupid he had been for not figuring out sooner. He also recalled the thug in the mecha suit saying that he worked for Ridley, and that could only mean one thing. The Black Shadow organization. They did this, Ron quickly said to himself darkly. While he and Kim knew that this was a powerful criminal organization and a force to be reckoned with, Ron had no idea just how far the organization was willing to go until now. They were truly a threat to be feared, and if it was the extent Black Shadow was willing to go under order to achieve their sick goals, the one thing Ron couldn't understand or figure it out though, was why Ridley decided to attack Japan. He tried thinking of any reason Ridley could have done such a thing, but then the thought occurred to Ron that he hadn't considered it. It was only a guess, but not too far from being possible. Ron wondered if maybe Ridley had done this to send a message to Team Possible as to just how powerful his organization actually was. And then there was the Namanochi Ninja School. Very few people knew of its location, since it was kept secret, but Ron knew that Global Justice knew about it, and Team Possible did as well. Was it possible that Ridley had found it somehow and bombed Japan to destroy it? If that had been the case, why would Ridley go such as far as use a nuclear bomb instead of just outright attacking through the other means? Ron had no answers, but if he had to guess, it might have had something to do with being a show of power. Regardless of whatever reasons Ridley had for doing this, Ron knew that the Black Shadow was far more dangerous than anyone could have ever predicted, and Ridley had certainly proved it. He had destroyed 3 regions of Japan, killing millions, and poisoned the land with radiation that would last for centuries to come. The massive crater from the blast served as a brutal reminder of this horrible tragedy. It was crowned to atop Ridley's path upon Japan, and Ron only stood 200 feet from it. He didn't even consider going towards it since the radiation levels were the highest near the center of the crater. Ron just gazed at the mountains and knew that the Yamanochi Ninja School was up there somewhere, but deep down he knew that there was no way it could have survived the nuclear blast. But he was just so desperate to find out what happened to it. Ron then rushed towards the mountains again, with the superhuman speed, using his mystical monkey powers, hoping to find Yori, Sensei, and the other ninjas. It took Ron over 15 minutes to reach the mountains with his current running speed. Then he come across a wide field of burnt trees. He assumed that it had been the forest before the bomb hit it. Yet, now the trees were just charred, burned up sticks on the ground. Ron had crossed the front of the burned forest and eventually came across the hill that led upwards towards the burned mountains. Then began climbing up the hill. Ron eventually came to the top of the hill where it got a full view of the sea near to the edge, with the charred, melted Grundrill just dangling off of the ground of the edge. A sheer drop leading down about 30 feet into the sea that could only be over the edge, where Ron had caught a glimpse of sharp rocks at the bottom. The road was cracked and burned like the one way back near the mountains of Yamadochi City. It was only in the worst state than it ever had been. Ron had looked around the area and began walking up the road towards a higher area of the burned forest mountain. When it came across yet another burning forest, he reached out with his mystical monkey powers, and senses it caught a faint of a familiar scent afar from the burning forest. "Yori! Sensei!" Ron gasped, then began rushing through the forest. Rufus had held on tightly inside of his pouch as Ron sped through the burnt forest, fearing of what they would find at the end. Ron was far more frightened than Rufus as he passed rows and rows of burnt trees and ash. He was pretty sure he wasn't going to like what he'd find at the end, but Ron was still clinging to that false hope that everything would be alright, and that he'd find Sensei and Yori waiting for him on the other side. Once Ron reached to the end of the burned forest, he came upon a sight that nearly destroyed him. Although the land had been ravaged and burnt from the nuclear blast, parts of the areas were slightly recognizable. Ron could make up piles of charred wood, metal, and rubble that had unmistakably belonged to what was once the Yamadochi Ninja School. The buildings was once filled with life and beauty, were now nothing but dust, rubble, and ash. The rest of the mountains surrounding the area were also in the same state as the rest of the burnt forest. All the trees and vegetation that had once existed, flourished, were now dead and reduced to ash. Ron fell into despair upon realizing that they were just pretty much the remains of the Yamadochi Ninja School. Feeling all the tears rise in his eyes, he caught a glimpse of something nearby in the burnt soil. Upon moving closer, he realized that they were just human skeletons, all charred black and into pieces. And they weren't just one or two, there were dozens of them. Ron then saw a few skeletons laying in the soil near the remains of the ninja school. Then a few scattered plate pieces were near of one of the burnt trees. Ron just approached one of them and reached down with a trembling hand and then tapped on the skull, just the right one, and it quickly crumbled into ash with just one touch. There was no way for Ron to know who these skeletons were once belonged to, but he dreaded to think that Yori's might have been one of them. Death was all around Ron and Rufus, and they knew that they'd see all that for miles and miles. "Ron," Rufus said, trying to get his attention. Ron didn't say anything, though. He just simply stared at the charred human bones with the expression of devoid of emotion. The sight of death and destruction had shattered Ron's spirit, and he didn't know what to do. Ron knew at this point that he would have to accept the fact that Yori was most likely dead, like Kim had insisted earlier. None of the other ninjas had survived, and neither had Master Sensei, so Ron was pretty sure that Yori had perished in the blast as well. The nuclear blast had leveled within 100 megatons of destructive force, and it destroyed the whole regions in the process, leaving no survivors. As talented and skilled Yori was, Ron knew that she wouldn't be able to outrun the nuclear blast, and he hadn't seen anything so far that would lead underground. Even if Yori managed to get far underground, Ron knew that she wouldn't last long due to the radiation in the air. He briefly remembered seeing a manhole cover near the back of the middle of the road, leading to the mountains, and he wondered if Yori might have fled inside it to avoid the blast. Even if she did, though, Ron knew that the manhole cover wasn't foolproof, and even if Yori entered it, the radiation would still leak through the small openings in the manhole cover and flood the underground chamber over time. She's never survived inside a manhole with all this radiation in the air, Ron thought, and without food or water, Yori would die of thirst and starvation. That's as if the radiation didn't kill her first. Either way, Yori would be plain dead in the environment like this. Ron had remembered reading in the history books that many Japanese citizens who had been underground after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki eventually died of either thirst, starvation, or radiation poisoning. The nuclear bombs used in that period of time were far less advanced than the ones used today, and those bombs only took out more cities. Yet the one the Black Shadow used was far more powerful than had taken out of the three whole regions, and the radiation left it behind was far deadlier and stronger. It would linger for decades, perhaps even centuries. Even with the radiation scrubbing technology adapted from the Laudorian technology, the land would never be the same again. Japan would be a shell of its former self for years and years to come. Ron gazed over at the burned skeletons and the scorched up ground around him, wondering if their deaths had been swift and painless. He knew that the nuclear blast would eventually vaporize a person on contact, and that was basically the easiest way to go. But those who had survived avoided it would have hadn't seen the fallout radiation set of it. Ron began to read how horrible it was to die from all the effects of radiation poisoning, and death by thirst or starvation wasn't even better. However, out of those three ways to die, radiation poisoning was probably the worst of them all. If a survivor was struck with radiation poisoning, they'd soon be begging for death after horrible effects set in. The victim would become nauseous, dizzy, and then they'd start vomiting and bleed through their sweat glands. Their hair would also fall out in the process over time, and the victim would eventually die of blood loss after bleeding to death through their pores. For one brief moment, Ron pictured Yori slowly dying of radiation poisoning somewhere underground, her beautiful hair falling out as she lay in a pool of her own blood while vomiting and bleeding slowly to death. He couldn't even begin to grasp the gravity of that nightmare, so he forced it out of his mind, not wanting to even consider such a thing. Ron knew his only hope was that Yori's death had been quick and painless, but there was no way for him to truly know. All Ron could do was leave. There was nothing for him there. "She's not here," Ron said softly in a broken voice. "No one is." "We go?" Rufus asked sadly. "Yeah, we can't stay here. It's not safe here," Ron replied, then headed back through the burnt forest. He didn't even bother running like before. He just simply walked slowly as the scorched ground, kicking up flakes of ash along the way. Ron was broken inside, broken over losing one of his best friends, and his spirit was nearly shattered upon the tragedy that lay all around him. As Ron trudged slowly through the rows of burnt trees, he remembered what Master Sensei had told him 2 nights ago about how this time his was drawing nearer, and it all made sense now. Sensei had foreseen a terrible disaster, and he urged Ron not to worry about him and the other ninjas. He just couldn't understand why Sensei and his ninjas didn't flee Japan if he knew a horrible disaster would happen. As Ron thought about it, he then felt a wave of anger rush through him. Sensei had known something bad would happen, but yet he did nothing. He just simply sat back and allowed himself and his fellow students to be burnt up in the nuclear explosion. And to top it off, Yori was now dead as well, all because Sensei refused to alert his students and retreat to safety. Ron suddenly remembered Sensei also telling him to remain in the light, and if all went wrong, or the darkness would claim him, Ron then remembered the dark power he unwillingly tapped in fighting that mecha-suited thug in the train yards. Just then, that was just a little while ago. Was that darkness Sensei was referring to? Ron wondered as he began to approach the end of the burned forest. He couldn't be so sure, but he was pretty convinced that this strange, sinister power had to be it. Ron was still curious as well as to how much this power was, but even now Sensei was dead. There had been no way for him to learn about it. Ron only knew so much a little about his new abilities, and really what worried him. However, he had pretty much guessed the emotions as much longer hatred waited for him to learn more about it. Ron knew so little about his new abilities, and it really worried him. However, he had pretty much just guessed that his emotions, such as anger, hatred, and sorrow, seemed to trigger these new powers inside of him. Given his experience using him, that was to the part that worried him. If Ron had been trying to keep his emotions under control, but after all the death and destruction around him, it made that impossible. All he felt was sorrow and anger towards the Black Shadow organization for attacking Japan and claiming the lives of millions, including Yori. Ron vowed to make them all pay for this, yet he had no idea where their bases even were, let alone what really looked like. He could only hope that Wade had managed to find something, or anything, that Black Shadow organization from the dark web. If he couldn't, then Ron and the rest of Team Possible would be completely dark on this criminal organization. As with Global Justice, Ron then tapped in a small wrist communicator built into his suit and tried calling for Wade, but the heavy amount of radiation in the air made it difficult. Looks like I better find a spot where the radiation levels are a little lower. I can't contact Wade from here, Ron muttered. He made his way out of the burnt forest and back across the road. He eventually saw that same manhole cover ahead of him. On the center of the road, he thought about just opening it out of curiosity, but quickly dismissed the idea. Ron was pretty sure that no one was in it, and even if there was, they're probably dead by now from all the radiation in the air. Simply just walked over the manhole and headed over down the road, wanting nothing more than to get out of this hell that was once Japan. Once Ron reached the bottom of the mountain, he came across what appeared to be the remains of a small burnt town. Most of the houses were nothing but rubble and ash, and all the vegetation was burnt away like the forest. Ron had scanned most of the area in his suit and found the radiation levels were still too high to try and call Wade, so he continued through the remains of the forest of the destroyed town. As Ron headed closer to town, he could see the remains of various cars, trucks nearby, half melted and almost unrecognizable. A few street lamps surprisingly survived, but still mounted deep into the ground, yet like the burnt up and completely useless now. And a few traffic signal poles can be tilted down at weird angles and melted as most of the other vehicles in the area. Ron then felt his heart sank further when he gazed at what remains of the various buildings around him, mostly reduced to the rubble and ash, yet still slightly intact. He wondered if the people living here had died quickly and painlessly when the nuclear bomb hit. Ron could only hope that they didn't suffer a slow, painful death from radiation poisoning, but he had no true way of knowing, or so he thought. As Ron passed, he assumed what had once been a small store. He heard Rufus suddenly squeal in horror and then whimper. "Rufus, what is it? What's wrong?" Ron asked in concern. Ron then saw through what seemed to be the pouch that Rufus was pointing at near the store, and he looked at pure dread and horror. "There!" Rufus stammered, in horror, as skin as pale as a ghost. Ron looked over to where Rufus was pointing and immediately wished he didn't have it. Ron saw the front door was completely gone. Just laying in front of the entrance, what appeared to be a young man with his legs completely blown off. His entire body was behind recognition, but that wasn't the most horrifying part. It turns out the man was still alive and slowly dragging himself out of the building, moaning and whimpering in pure agony. Ron felt himself tremble in fear, as the burnt shell of the human man didn't just stop outside of the destroyed building, rolled himself onto his back, letting out a brief scream of what Ron could only describe as pure agony and pain. He couldn't even understand how this person could still be alive during that nuclear blast. But Ron pretty much guessed it that the man inside the building when the bomb struck, so he had been instantly vaporized like everything else outside. Then Ron watched as the man slowly turns his head to face him, and it looked amount of willpower Ron had to not vomit in the horror of what he saw. The man's face was almost burned off completely, and Ron could see one of his eyeballs actually dangling out of his head, and the other one still barely intact. It looked as if almost a burnt face of a zombie, and just the sight of, let alone, sent a wave of horror running down Ron's spine. Rufus whimpered and then shook off even more as the burnt man suddenly raised a burnt arm and hand off the ground towards Ron. He even muttered something unintelligible. Ron had tried to step in a little closer to try and make out what this person was saying, but their voice sounded raspy and broken. It was so very hard to understand what being said. However, upon turning up the volume of the suit's output speakers, Ron could hear what the man was saying, something raspy, almost unrecognizable tone of his voice. Upon listening harder, Ron could make out something. Oka-san, Oka-san. I don't, Ron stammered, not even knowing what to say. His mind was still raced with terror and fear. Oka-san, the burned man rasped again. Ron suddenly realized the man was speaking in his own native Japanese language, so he activated his suits in the built-in translator. Ron quickly understood what the man was saying. It was a single word that brought tears to Ron's eyes, almost broke his spirit entirely, if it weren't already broken enough. He's calling for his mother, Ron thought, as his heart sank deeper in despair. Oka-san! Oka-san! The man suddenly called out again, this time in the more desperate voice. Then he said something else before calling out to his mother again. He then continued to moan and whimper in agony. Ron's translator managed to translate everything, though, and what it only worsened the sorrow already built up inside of him. It hurts! Mother! Hurts! Mother! The translator read. Ron then felt his tears flow as he backed away from the burned, living shell of the man. He couldn't even begin to imagine the amount of pain and agony the man must have been going through in that very moment. The worst part, he had been alive after the bomb hit. Ron wanted nothing more to do than to help this poor soul, but deep down, he knew it was impossible. The man had already lost both his legs, a heavy amount of blood, and was injured beyond to the point of no return. The only thing that could possibly be done was to end this man's life and put him out of his misery. But Ron shook out that thought of doing that. Killing 2 alien warlords had been one thing, but killing another human being was the line Ron had never crossed before, and it wasn't a line he was never willing to cross unless it was his own life on the line. Even now, Ron couldn't bring himself to do it, even though he'd probably be doing this person a favor by killing him. Ron knew that leaving this man alive could only prolong his suffering, but he just couldn't bear the fact of killing another human being. Even out of mercy, Ron backed away further as the man continued to call out, surrounding more and more desperate from the further away Ron got. I can't do it, Ron said softly, as he ran away as fast as he could, tears streaming down his face.